think we'll get started here, just in the interest of starting on time. Welcome everyone. My name is Makayla Nowee, and thank you for joining us today for our Let's Talk About series. This week we will be discussing anticipatory grief. So just a little bit about me. I'm the Bereavement Program Intern here. I just graduated from Nipissing University with my Bachelor in Social Work. I did my placement mostly in bereavement here at Near North Palliative Care Network, and now I luckily was hired on and have been working here for the past few months. And today I'll be giving you some information and hopefully helpful and useful information on anticipatory grief and how to support people going through anticipatory grief, or whether you're going through that yourself. So, all right, so I'll just go through kind of what we're going to talk about today. So we'll start with what is anticipatory grief. Definitely not a topic that we discuss every day. I'll go into some examples of anticipatory grief, just so we get a better grasp on that. COVID-19 and anticipatory grief, which is something I'm sure we're all dealing with right now. Common reactions, and how can we help? Because that's what we all want to know how to do, is how can we support people going through anticipatory grief. And then I'll leave a bit of time at the end for questions and comments. And you can put those in the chat bar. All right. So what is anticipatory grief? So this is my understanding and what I gathered from the various definitions that I found. So a feeling of grief or grief reactions, sadness, anger, denial occurring before the loss of something or someone. So a lot of the definitions I found online about anticipatory grief were directly related to the death of someone, but like with grief after a loss, it can also be loss of control, loss of a job, loss of a relationship, things like that. It doesn't have to be death related. And we'll get into more examples of that will make it more clear, but hopefully that makes sense. My main point here is that anticipatory grief is the feeling before the loss has actually occurred, and that loss does not have to be a death. So I found this metaphor for anticipatory grief from Teresa Rando in her book, Loss and Anticipatory Grief. So it says, imagine yourself about to step through a doorway. Just as you start through it, you see that the door is slowly swinging shut. You have no control over the closing of the door, but you do have time to slow your pace, think of other possible directions to take, and to step back far enough so the closing door will not injure you. You have time to prepare yourself. The inevitable is known in advance, and there's time for preparation. So the only part that I maybe disagree with in this quote is that if you prepare, you won't be injured or hurt. I think even if you have all the time in the world to prepare for the death of a loved one or for a loss, even if we started preparing when we were children, I think that loss and that death would hurt just as much, no matter how much we prepare for it. If you were here for our presentation last week, Jana and Tracy were talking about death doulas, and one of their roles is preparing people for death. And they were talking about Swedish death cleaning, which is basically like a deep organization of your things, so that when you die, everything goes where you want it to go in terms of family, being thrown out, being kept, things like that. So when this metaphor talks about having time to prepare and slow your pace, that's an example of how we can do that. So anticipatory grief is still painful. You can see that you're about to lose something and you don't have control over that. But the positive thing is that we do have time to prepare. And whatever that means for us, preparing for a loss looks different for every person, for every situation. For example, if you're anticipating the loss of a job, for example, you know you'll be laid off soon. You're probably feeling the effects of anticipatory grief, confusion, uncertainty, loss of control. but you do have the time to think about, okay, what's next? You might start to look for other jobs, look into financial support. Those types of things are all ways that we prepare for a loss of a job. And I think depending on the loss, our preparation will look different. But with anticipatory grief, we do have that time to prepare and process. All right, so going into reactions to anticipatory grief. So signs or results of anticipatory grief can span over various aspects of our lives: our mental, our thinking, our emotional, our feelings, physical, somatic symptoms, and spiritual. So some of the thinking patterns we might see with anticipatory grief are confusion, maybe bad dreams, feeling anxious, having a hard time remembering things. Anticipatory grief can be very stressful because you may be in constant anticipation thinking of the upcoming loss, which can really affect your mental well-being. And emotional reactions to anticipatory grief can be very difficult for everyone, but sadness, anger, guilt can be common ones. Physical reactions are very common when our bodies are under stress because of anticipatory grief. You might have trouble sleeping, headaches, things like that. And then spiritual reactions can be things like questioning your faith or religion, questioning your spirituality, bargaining, things like that. So I just want to say, if you are experiencing anticipatory grief and these reactions, then it's a very natural and normal process to go through. And if these reactions are really affecting your day-to-day life, please reach out for support. Reach out to your doctor and let them know. Reach out to your support systems and let them know that you're dealing with that. So these are all very similar to the reactions we see in grief and bereavement after the loss has occurred. I think it can be helpful for people to name what they're going through. So having a name for anticipatory grief is helpful, especially, for example, if you're a caregiver and you're experiencing some of these things. You might feel like, what is going on? Like, the person hasn't died yet. Why am I having grief reactions? But that's completely valid and normal, a normal thing to go through. So, all right. So now I'll go into some examples of anticipatory grief. So one example of this is dementia grief. So the dementia grief model discusses the pre-death grief or anticipatory grief that caregivers or family members of people living with dementia face, or the person living with dementia themselves face. So a research article by Blandon and Pepin says that dementia grief is a specific type of anticipatory grief in response to compounded serial losses of varying magnitude and marked by the ambiguity that characterizes the experience of loss in dementia. So in more clear terms, basically, it's anticipating the loss of things that are common along the trajectory of dementia. So, for example, maybe a loss of a sense of identity, anticipating the loss of memory shared together with that person, a loss of shared responsibilities and chores, grieving the loss of future plans, future dreams, things like that may not be able to happen. Speaking from personal experience, my Oma, when she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, really experienced anticipatory grief around knowing one day that she might not be able to remember her husband and her kids, and that was really hard for her. And then my Opa was her primary caregiver, and he experienced pre-dementia grief and went through a lot of grief reactions like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, those stages that we know. And he experienced all of these over and over again until she passed away. And I like this image because it shows, these stages that we talk about often when we talk about grief are really not linear stages that we go through. They are all over the place, and grief reactions come in waves. It's not a linear process. So back to that article, interestingly, it mentions that caregivers of people living with dementia, their degree of anticipatory grief can affect their degree of complicated grief after the person has died. So that if they have a high level of dementia grief, pre-death grief, and do not have the proper supports, then this can result in complicated grief after the person has died. So I think that's an important reason to talk about this, because it doesn't make the death or loss any easier to deal with if you start thinking about pre-death grief, but maybe then we have some coping tools and resources already under our belt that we can use once the loss actually happens. So this article also discusses that dementia grief is unique from anticipatory grief and can be very difficult for caregivers because the loss of verbal communication may happen early on in dementia, whereas for other illnesses, there may be more of an ability for the person to communicate memories and goodbyes and things like that verbally. So if you'd like more information or resources or support on dementia grief, I have a ton of those. So I have my email in the last slide, so you can always email me if you're interested in more information on that. So next I'm going to talk about anticipatory grief in caregivers. So talking specifically about illness and caregivers who are caring for their aging parents or a family member with a life-threatening, life-limiting illness. Anticipatory grief can be very common. So people used to focus on anticipatory grief only in the actual person who was dying, but we now know that caregivers, family members also experience anticipatory grief, anticipating the loss of their loved ones. And we do living in an aging society. More and more of us are becoming caregivers to our aging family members, neighbors, friends. And with the growing sandwich generation of people who are looking after both their aging parents and their children, I think it's all the more important for us to recognize and validate this concept of anticipatory grief. So, in an article by the Family Caregiver Alliance, they say that caregivers may experience guilt and shame for wishing it were over, or thinking of their loved one as already gone, especially when someone has a cognitive impairment. These feelings and reactions are totally common and normal to have. Someone commented on our Facebook post about this topic and expressed the mixed emotions of holding on to hope or letting go and not knowing what to do. And I think that's a very common feeling in anticipatory grief, in that inner mixed emotions of not knowing what is best to do. And I don't think there is a best thing to do. I think there's no right way to go about it. Anticipatory grief, just like grief after a loss, is so uniquely individual to a person. So, and the article in the journal, I looked at the Journal of Hospice and Palliative Nursing, says that some of the best ways that we can support a caregiver who is going through anticipatory grief is to provide information on it, normalize their feelings, as well as helping with some of the physical symptoms and education around the effects of stress on the body. Because we know that anticipatory grief can have the same physical impacts on the body as grief after the loss has occurred. And then I just want to finish this section by saying that relief after the loss is normal. In an article by Lisa Williams discussing her experience with caregiving and anticipatory grief and her grief after her loss, she says, in the case of anticipated losses, there can be months, years, and even decades of caregiving that can be overwhelming and exhausting. When someone dies, there can be a sense of relief that is completely normal, but that can also create feelings of guilt. Remember that feeling relief after an anticipated loss does not mean you love the person any less. It is a normal reaction after a stressful and overwhelming time in your life. So I just want to end that section with that. So I want to talk about anticipatory grief and COVID-19, because I think a lot of us are experiencing this type of grief when it comes to this pandemic. I don't know about for you joining us today, but I'm already anticipating the loss of knowing my usual fall activities will be canceled. I've been going to a fall fair every Thanksgiving since I was born, so I'm grieving that tradition, which seems like a small thing, but I think being aware of those things for ourselves, validating that as a loss can really help us in accepting and coping the situations that we're in. Maybe you're going back to school in a couple of weeks and you're anticipating the loss of in-person classes, seeing your friends every day, loss of normalcy. So when it comes to anticipatory grief, a common theme that I found is the feeling of a loss of a sense of control, because you know the loss is coming and you may feel like there's nothing you can do about it. So I found this great illustration by Carrie Stevens for when it comes to gaining back a sense of control, which can be helpful in dealing with this type of grief. So I'll continue on the example of anticipatory grief and COVID. So things you can control when dealing with this type of grief are your attitude, turning off the news, how you follow health guidelines, limiting social media if that's something that is anxiety provoking for you, finding distractions or fun things to do at home. And she says kindness and grace, both for yourself and for others in this time, are all things that can help cope with this anticipatory grief around COVID. And then things we can't control and therefore we can try to let go of, which is easier said than done sometimes, but other people following the rules of social distancing, predicting what can happen. None of us can see the future, so we can try to let go of that, trying to predict what's going to happen. We can't control how others react, how long this will last, or the amount of toilet paper at the store, she says. I think we're past that now, hopefully, but so just a good note for if you're experiencing anticipatory grief related to anything really, to try to focus on what you can control about the situation, and that might make what we can't control feel a little less intimidating. So now on to what we all want to know is supporting someone through anticipatory grief. Just as we near the end of the presentation, I'm going to answer any questions. So if you have any, now would be a good time to type them in the chat box so that we can get to those at the end. So some practical examples and tips for how to support someone through this type of grief. So the most important thing we emphasize in our bereavement training is validating the person's feelings of grief. So validating can be saying things like, you're allowed to feel your grief no matter the type of loss. This is a natural response to the stress that you're facing right now. Anticipating a loss can be as difficult as experiencing the actual loss. So saying things like that can just make the person feel valued, heard, and respected, which is what we want. So, and listening, I think this is the biggest thing we do to support people, is providing a non-judgmental listening ear that just acknowledges and validates the person's feelings and lets them know that what they're feeling is valid and important to you, is a big way to support people through any kind of grief. And then normalizing anticipatory grief. One of the ways we normalize things are by having open and honest conversations with our friends and family about grief. Some people can shy away from that topic, and in the society we live in, I think that's a normal thing and a natural thing to do, but it can be an uncomfortable topic, but it doesn't have to be. So sometimes with anticipatory grief and grief after the loss, people don't know what to say, so they may withdraw from the person who is grieving. And I would just say that it's better to say the wrong thing and learn from it than to say nothing and withdraw from our friendships and relationships if we don't know what to say. Anticipatory grief can be a very isolating experience, same with grief after loss. So if we start to normalize and talk about these things, the easier it will become for us. And we're all human beings and we might say the wrong thing. We just have to be willing to hear criticism and feedback and learn from it to know better for next time. So I would just encourage you with that. And then finally, help the person to prepare for the loss, whatever that may be. So, and if they want help, of course. Maybe their parents are preparing to move out of their childhood home, they're moving into retirement living, they're anticipating the loss of their childhood home. You can help them to remember the good memories, take pictures, whatever it is for that person that they tell you would be helpful for them in preparing for that loss and for that grief. So, all right. So that's all for my presentation portion. If anyone has any questions, they can type them in the chat bar. I will stay on for a bit and take those. But if you're more comfortable, I have my email address here. You're more than welcome to email me questions or contact me at the office. But yeah, once you close this webinar, hopefully a survey will come up with just some questions about how you felt about this presentation. Also, any idea topics that you'd be interested in learning about would also be great. But yeah, I don't see any questions in the chat bar right now, but if you have any, always email me or phone the office and I can hopefully help to answer your question. But yeah, so thank you very much for joining us today. And I will stay on for a bit, but other than that, yeah, have a great day. Thank you.